As we have seen, God has already started over twice. With Adam, he began, and again he started over with Noah. And now what we will see is God begins again with Abram. Abram is, in some senses at least perhaps, a third Adam. God is starting fresh with a new person to accomplish his plan. Now he's not starting over with a whole new creation or a whole new humanity, but he is beginning again, as we see, with the covenant that he's going to make with Abram. Abram is going to be seen as a paradigm for following God by faith. We've already talked briefly about that Abram's faith is credited to him as righteousness in Genesis 15:6. But that's really crucial and central to this whole narrative, as we will see. The structure of the narratives, the structure of the Abraham stories, is significant. As you see it here, this is what we call a chiasm, or perhaps you could call it a framing structure. So the central focus is really in the middle, and the other elements around it are understood as frames. So it begins with a genealogy and ends with a genealogy, but inside that there are commands. The command in chapter 12 is to go, and to go to a new land. But the command in chapter 22 is to go, but in this case it is to offer up the very result of promise that God had given to him. So all of this focuses our attention on the relationship that God has established with Abram, which we call the Abrahamic covenant. What I'd like to do is spend just a few minutes thinking about what God is doing with that Abrahamic covenant. It actually begins with a promise that he makes in chapter 12, but it's formalized in chapter 15. It's reiterated in chapter 17, which is E prime. And then, of course, it is challenged or tested in chapter 22, the climax of the set of Abrahamic stories. So let's think just a little bit about what God is doing with Abraham, and therefore with the nation of Israel. Abram's Odyssey begins really in chapter 12. Now certainly we see the beginning of it at the end of chapter 11, where we see him turning up Haran, and we find out in chapter 12 the reason he's at Haran is because God has told him to go. But in Genesis chapter 12, God is telling him that he needs to go because God is promising him that he is going to make a whole set of things happen for him. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." He calls him to leave everything that is security for him, everything that he knows, everything that is dear to him. He leaves his country, he leaves his relatives, he leaves his father's house, and yet God promises to replace all of those things. He promises to make him a great nation, to take him to a new land, to bless him, to make his name great. The irony here that I've already mentioned is that what mankind is seeking on his own, looking for a name for himself, God offers freely to those who will follow him by faith. And this is his identity, but it's also his security. And so God is promising to take care of him. God is promising to give him not only all he needs, but he's promising to give him, in some senses, immortality as his name becomes great. Now, there's obviously more to it than that, but at least what we see with the promises is that God is giving him opportunity, that if he will go by faith, God is going to reward him tremendously, dramatically. The purpose in making these promises really shows up at the end of verse 2. I like the ESV translation, so that you will be a blessing. The "so that you will be a blessing," I believe, is clearly the purpose for what God is calling him to do. He's not giving him a second command, you need to be a blessing, but he's saying, if you will leave, you can be a blessing. And in fact, I will use you to be a blessing. And he explains that in verse 3, where he says that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Of course, the one who curses him will be cursed, but those who bless him will be blessed, and in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. So the purpose for what God wants to do through Abram is ultimately to bring blessing to all people. God is reversing the effects of the curse, as your reading made clear, and he is bringing about the opportunity for blessing, which is crucial for Israel to understand, and it's necessary for us to understand as well. The promise to Abram, then, as God makes it, can be summarized, at least the ongoing promise to Abram, not the initial promise to Abram of making his name great, which was personal, but the ongoing promise to Abram that will follow through for his descendants because of Abram's faith and because of the covenant God will make with him, can be summarized in three categories. The land is significant because this is the place that God is going to plant his people so that they are at a central crossroads of the known world. That means that they will have opportunity to impact the world for God, to show the world who God is, and to show the world how they can obtain blessing as well. Of course, that means that he has to have a nation that will be there, so that is the promise of descendants, the promise of the nation of Israel, and that promise is going to continue because God, as in choosing these people, promises to preserve them to accomplish his purpose, his promise. And of course, that purpose, that promise, is blessing, that in them all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, certainly he promises to bless Abram, and Abram is blessed, but that's the means by which he can accomplish the ultimate promise of blessing, and that is to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. So even as he brings tangible blessing to Abram and to Israel, the ultimate working of the covenant is purposing to bring eternal blessing to all the families of the earth. And in fact, what Israel has to learn is that blessing is really not the stuff that they get. That blessing is that relationship with God. And so the reality of blessing is independent of what they have. The covenant is unilateral. That means that the covenant is one-sided. When God actually makes the covenant in chapter 15, you see Abram laying out for God the animals, and God alone goes between the pieces. That means that God alone is promising that he will accomplish this promise regardless of Abram, regardless of Israel. God will do it. Now, of course, those who participate in it are only those who are going to be acting by faith. But God is going to accomplish his promise. It is, therefore, one-sided. God is the only one doing it. The emphasis on promise shows, however, that there is responsibility for the individuals, and that's going to show up not only within the Mosaic covenant, but even implicitly within the Abrahamic covenant, as God calls Abram even to offer his son in chapter 22. The Abrahamic covenant, then, needs to be summarized in terms of the promise, that is, land, seed, and blessing, and understood as a result of relationship with God and the means to accomplish the purpose that God has for them. So God is trying to accomplish a purpose of bringing blessing to the families of the earth. This is simply a means to that promise that gives them responsibility then, living by faith, walking with God, so that they can show the world who God is. Again, the blessing isn't the stuff they get. The blessing ultimately is that relationship with the Creator. In Genesis 17, we see that reiterated. So in the center portion of the Abrahamic stories, we see the covenant being cut, the covenant being literally made with Abram in chapter 15, and being repeated, being reiterated in chapter 17, where God calls Abram to walk before me and be blameless. That call is, as I've mentioned earlier, is not to be perfect. Blamelessness here is not perfection, but it is integrity. He's asking God to live before him in integrity and responsibility, enjoying that relationship. Blamelessness, then, is what God calls Abram, Israel, and us to live to God, live before him in integrity. If we were to summarize, then, the section that we've looked at so far, and looking at the big picture, we see that God begins with a command in chapter 12, and he evaluates that command in chapter 15. Chapter 15:6, God says, Abram believed God and he credited to him as righteousness. I believe it's clear both from the initial context, but also from the wider biblical context, that this is not when Abram initially believes God. But instead, what God is saying here in Genesis 15:6 is that Abram is a believer. We've seen his faith from the time he left Ur of the Chaldees. So Abram is a believer, and so therefore he is righteous before God. God declares him righteous, and God is able to make his covenant with him, which is what follows in Genesis 15:7 and following. We see then the evaluation of Abram's call in chapter 12 in chapter 15. So God says, go, and God says in chapter 15, he's a believer. He went. In chapter 17, God gives him a second call. God gives him a second set of commands. Walk before me and be blameless. That second set of commands is actually evaluated in chapter 22 when we see at the end of the testing, when Abram offers Isaac his son, and the angel says, stop. He says, now I know that you fear God. And so the evaluation of Abram's call to a life of faith, of walking before God in integrity and relationship, is evaluated by the demonstration of his faith in chapter 22, when it is clearly shown to all that Abram does indeed trust God beyond crazy, wild imagination, even being willing to give back the very promise that God had given to him, assuming perhaps that God is going to have to do something else. What is it that he's going to do? Well, when we see the offering of Isaac, we see an immediate response in Abram of taking him early the next morning. And God, in testing Abram, is demonstrating not just for God's benefit, but ultimately for our benefit, the faith of Abram. So what we see when the angel says, now I know that you fear God, is that God is publicly declaring that faith of Abraham as complete. Abram, if we look at Hebrews, had to have been assuming that God is just going to have to bring him back to life, because this is the very promise that God had said. And yet God chose otherwise. God provided a ram. God provided elsewhere. The interesting thing here is that the very hill that Abram offers Isaac up on is Moriah. Moriah, as we will find later, is the place where Solomon will build the temple. And of course, that is the place where sacrifices will be offered, and ultimately it is close by where Jesus will offer himself.